Okay, so two forms of what we call non-associative learning are habituation and sensitization. And there's sort of opposite sides here. Habituation is the process by which we respond less strongly over time to repeated presentations of stimuli. It is the simplest form of what we refer to as non-associative learning, right? Which is learning a response to a single stimulus and not associations between stimuli. And simple non-associative kind of learning examples are even found in single-celled organisms like the amoeba, which will habituate also to repeated presentations of non-threatening sorts of stimuli. Now, there's a Nobel Prize-winning researcher, Eric Kandel, who won the 2000 prize in physiology or medicine, and he investigated learning and memory using an animal model that's called the Aplysia. It's a 5-inch long sea slug found off the coast of California, and it's got this very delicate gill for breathing. It'll sort of extend it out and then pass water over it, with this sort of tube-like structure called the siphon, and it allows it to engage in respiration. But if it is touched, let's say, on the siphon or on its tail, for example, it'll rapidly withdraw that gill and hold it in. There's something that's potentially of a threat to it. And Kandel found that if you poke its tail or its siphon sort of repeatedly, and not in a threatening or harmful manner, but just keep poking it, that gill withdrawal response will actually habituate. It'll become, less dramatic, and it will hold it in for, not as long a time, for example, right? And Kandel, he's famous. He won the prize to some extent for discovering that, the Aplysia can habituate in the short term. Like if you do it just a couple times, it'll do that. But if you wait a little bit of time, you come back, it'll have the full-on response again. But if you keep doing it, and you keep doing it again and again and again and again, you get sort of long-term habituation. You get, the Aplysia no longer, really withdrawing much at all. And he discovered that for Aplysia that had actually habituated long-term, there were actual physical changes in the neural connections, in the neural network that linked, the sort of somatosensory, the touch detection at the siphon, to the motor, or efferent gill withdrawal sorts of response, right? And in terms of sensitization, he also looked at sensitization. This is, if you have some cases of sort of repeated exposure, and this is usually to more dangerous or sort of irritating stimuli, can lead to an increased response, so much greater gill, response, gill withdrawal response over time. So Kandel studied this behavior also in Aplysia as part of this Nobel Prize-winning work, and he used an electric shock to the tail and then would touch the siphon, and he would see a pretty significantly sensitized response following that tail shock. And he also found there could be sort of shorter term functional changes, like one shock, then you touch it, boo, it's got a much bigger, withdrawal response than it did be if you hadn't shocked it, right? But if there were repeated shocks on the tail, he found long-term sensitization. It would last, more than 24 hours. This, Aplysia would really withdraw after multiple shocks, on its tail. And he also found, again, structural changes in the network that reflected that increased response. The neural network that linked the detection, of the touch on the siphon, let's say, to the motor efferent, withdrawal, basically, of that gill. And that those changes reflected that long-term, sensitization, basically, of this behavioral response. So short-term changes, short-term habituation or sensitization, are accompanied by short-term alterations in the function of existing networks that link, sort of sensory detection to, motor or efferent responses, right? So there are changes in the function of these network connections, how information travels along these relevant networks, for a period of time that lasts for a short time. But longer-term habituation and sensitization, that requires changes in gene expression, and more persistent structural changes in connectivity. And for this is, one of the reasons, the primary sort of reason that Eric Kandel won that Nobel Prize.